Dames en heren, welkom namens het Zoeterbrug-programma en de faculteit Managementwetenschappen bij deze avond met Thomas Pogge. De avond gaat helemaal in het Engels plaatsvinden en daarom switch ik nu ook naar het Engels. Welcome on this evening with Thomas Pogge. For most of you, I suppose Thomas Pogge is a well-known name. He's a philosopher from German origin, but he has lived in America for almost 40 years. He's a philosopher. He's written about Kant, but his fame is especially on the subject of global justice. His book, World Poverty and Human Rights, is famous. And everybody who is interested in global justice and poverty, the poverty problem, will know his name. Every book mentions him. We're very happy that he is our guest this evening. Professor Pogge, very welcome. Here, please. Or do you have to use? After Professor Pogge's lecture, Radboud, he sits on the corner there, will interview him, and you will be invited to ask him questions. Radboud is a PhD researcher at our university, and he is especially interested in mensenrechten en mensenplichten, which is also a theme which is very familiar to the theme of Dr. Pogge. Please.
Good. So I'm supposed to speak about consumer responsibilities in a world of hunger and unequal development. And the topic comes up because we know that many of the things we consume every day are produced in foreign countries, and we know something about the living conditions in these foreign countries. We know that people there suffer various kinds of deprivations, hunger, lack of clean water, lack of medical care, and so on and so forth. And we feel that we are in some way causally connected to them. But then, on the other hand, it's also a task that is way beyond our capacities to channel our consumer decisions in such a way that we exercise that responsibility, right? So, for example, if you are in the market for a new pair of shoes, it's very difficult for you to buy the shoes in such a way that you take into account the interests of all the people in all the different countries in the world and buy that pair of shoes which is such that the purchase has the best possible effects, doesn't harm anybody, maybe benefits people, and so on. So you might say, well, you could buy a fair trade product. You can buy fair trade chocolate or coffee or something like that, T-shirts. But even there, it's not clear what the consequences of your consumer decision are going to be. It's certainly going to help people who work for fair trade enterprises in the developing world, but it's also going to harm other producers who are not fair trade producers, and it may throw people out of work there. So, for example, if you buy fair trade coffee, it could help a producer in Guatemala where fair trade coffee is produced. It might at the same time harm somebody in Nicaragua, and maybe they need it much more. Maybe the kid will die as a consequence of the father or the mother losing her job or his job. So it's really very, very difficult for you to have any kind of sense of what the remote consequences or even the pretty immediate consequences of your consumer decisions are. And there are several reasons for that. One is that it is going through many different steps. So you buy from a retailer, the retailer buys from a wholesaler, the wholesaler imports, and so forth. And secondly, the consequences of your decisions are intermingled with the consequences of zillions of other decisions by other consumers, by other purchasing agents, by other retailers and wholesalers, and so on. So it's like a lot of people throwing stones into a pond, and you are trying to throw one stone in addition to see that you get a certain effect, maybe in terms of waves that hit the shoreline. It's basically hopeless. So at least many people have concluded that, and I think that is by and large right. And what I want to talk about today is basically how you can nevertheless think intelligently about your responsibility as somebody who, as a consumer and also in other ways, as a worker, for example, as a taxpayer, is connected, clearly connected to the fate of people in the developing world, many of whom are very badly off. So what I want to do is make a human rights argument. So in order to simplify somewhat, I will say, let's say that whatever our responsibilities are in detail for the justice of the world and the welfare of human beings, let's say what we clearly have is a responsibility with regard to the human rights of other people. So I start with a relatively minimal, relatively easy to accept human rights threshold, and start by looking a little bit at how human rights are conceived within the UN system. So in the UN system, we distinguish three different correlative duties, three kinds of duties that people have and governments have in particular, thanks to the fact that human rights exist, namely negative duties to respect, positive duties to protect, and positive duties to fulfill. I should quickly introduce the distinction between positive and negative duties. So negative duties are duties, this is a philosopher's distinction, duties that you can fulfill simply by doing nothing. So a negative duty requires you to refrain from certain things, like to refrain from torturing people, from assaulting people, from killing people, and so on. And by doing nothing all day long, you trivially fulfill that duty. A positive duty is a duty where you actually have to do something in order to fulfill it. So you cannot fulfill it by doing nothing. So a duty to protect is a positive duty. When you see that somebody is under attack, you have to protect that person. When you see that somebody is in need, you have to help that person. And that is what this duty to fulfill was initially interpreted as being. So it was a duty to provide. For example, when people are hit by an earthquake or a tsunami, there's a duty to try to fulfill their human rights by providing the things that they lack. But then in the mid-1990s, this was broadened to include also a duty to facilitate. This was done in a long commentary on the right to food, but it was really then applied across the board to all human rights across the board. And the basic idea here is that we should not merely wait until a disaster happens and then go out of our way to do something for people, but we should think proactively and already put, before any disaster strikes, institutions in place that reduce the damage that will occur if a catastrophe happens. So we should pre-position food in cases where a drought might happen, or we should install tsunami early warning equipment in cases where a tsunami might strike. So act proactively in a way to minimize damage. This was made part and parcel of the duty to fulfill, often combined with the phrase progressive realization, which, like the American phrase with all deliberate speed, means almost the exact opposite of what it appears to mean. Progressive realization means something like keep your sweet time, take your sweet time about it, no need to hurry. Anyway, what I'm proposing is to make, on the side of negative duties, a similar distinction to the one that was made with duties to fulfill, positive duties to fulfill, namely to distinguish between two different types of duties that we have thanks to the human rights of others. On the one hand, interactional duties, not to directly harm others in ways that violate their human rights. And secondly, not to participate in imposing institutions on them, by which I mean rules, practices, conventions, procedures, onto people that foreseeably and avoidably leave their human rights unfulfilled. So I want to say that, again, we have to make a similar distinction on the side of negative duties as we made on the side of positive duties, distinguishing between direct violations of human rights and indirect ones that pass through institutional arrangements, where you have structured a particular society or social system in such a way that it foreseeably and avoidably leads to human rights deficits. So this arrow just signifies that it's an analogous distinction. Now, with regard to negative duties, I think that the ordinary priority that we tend to give to the near and dear, and in particular to compatriots, is either not applicable or applicable to a much lesser extent. So when we think normally about poor people in other countries, we tend to think in terms of concentric circles of concern where we are less and less concerned with people the further away from us they are, not necessarily geographically, but maybe culturally or in terms of our sympathies. So we think that if we help anybody, well, then first and foremost, of course, we help our family members. Secondly, our friends, our relatives, our neighbors, people in our town, people in our country, other Europeans, and finally distant strangers. So that's the normal way in which people think about cascading concern outward, fading to the margins. Now, with regard to negative duties, I think this sort of idea of a fading concern is much less plausible. So let me give you a pedestrian example. Suppose that somebody has gone on vacation and comes back and you say, well, how was it? And the person says, well, it was fine, but there was one terrible thing that happened to me. I was driving drunk from a party and I ran over a child that was on the road late at night. But, you know, it wasn't so bad because it happened in Bulgaria, or it happened in India, in rural India, very far away with very distant people, and there was no chance that any Dutch person would be there. I mean, I was really away from all the Dutch people, so I couldn't possibly have endangered anybody from the Netherlands. And so it wasn't really such a bad thing. I think most of us would say that doesn't make a big difference. It doesn't really make a big difference whether you endangered people from your own country or whether you endangered people from a European country or a country that is very distant from Europe. And similarly, I think with institutional negative duties, we should have the same sort of idea that the concern is either not fading at all or it is fading only very minimally. We have as much of a responsibility to not to participate in imposing unjust institutions on distant strangers as we have not to impose unjust institutions upon our own compatriots. Just as we have as much of a reason not to torture distant strangers as we have not to torture compatriots. So that's why this is a pretty important move. If we can make that move, we can say that our responsibilities to distant strangers are not just these providing and helping responsibilities, which are very weak with regard to them relative to how strong they are with regard to compatriots or family members, but we also have with regard to them these negative duties not to impose unjust rules upon them. So what I said earlier is that I want to confine myself to human rights, and I make this here more explicit. So we of course have to ask what exactly are unjust rules that we are not allowed to help impose on other people. How does one recognize which rules are just or unjust? And as a very minimal conception of justice, I just want to propose this conception that rules are unjust when they foreseeably and avoidably cause a significant human rights deficit. When alternative rules would be available that would not impose or would not be associated with a similarly large human rights deficit. That's obviously not a complete conception of justice. Obviously, we all would want to say that there are additional conditions that a system of rules has to satisfy to count as just, but it's a minimal condition where we say, well, that at least a system of rules has to achieve in order to count as just. So one thing that we would additionally want is a condition or constraint on inequalities. We don't want a system to give rise to enormous inequalities, even if everybody has their human rights fulfilled. And maybe we want a kind of convergence and so forth. So there are other desiderata on a just system of rules, but human rights are at least a minimal condition. Now, this is not terribly original, this idea. It's already in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948, where it is said that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. And that's essentially what I'm trying to use here. Just say that for an international order, what we require is that it be shaped in such a way that human rights can be realized under it. So now I start with my argument. And the argument has the first step of the argument has two premises and then a conclusion that I use in the second step. The first premise is that under the present rules of the world economy, the human rights of most people foreseeably remain unfulfilled. So here is a bit of a statistical potpourri of numbers about poverty today, the kinds of deprivations that we associate with extreme poverty. And you can see that the latest numbers are still pretty bad. So we have very large numbers of people suffering chronic undernutrition, lack of essential medicines, lack of safe drinking water, adequate shelter, electricity, adequate sanitation, literacy, and then we have a lot of child labor still in the world. So if you add all these people up, of course there are sometimes the same people affected, but you might say that about half of the human population suffer from one of these deprivations or another. About half do not have fulfilled their human rights, their social and economic human rights, to a standard of living adequate for themselves and their family. The figures look even worse if you look at human deaths. At least 1/3 of all human beings die prematurely from poverty-related causes, and that's a conservative estimate that simply looks at those causes of death that are concentrated among the poor, that exist only in poor countries. You can see here what these causes are: diarrhea, malnutrition, and so on. Very few people in Europe die from these causes. Many people among the poor die from these causes, so we can be pretty sure that they are poverty-related. Now, there are additional deaths from poverty-related causes. For example, people die of cancer, of heart disease, of diabetes, and so on, in both rich countries and poor countries, but in poor countries often much sooner than we in rich countries die from those causes, because in these poor countries, often environmental pressures and vulnerabilities are greater, and often also medical care is much worse. So there are poverty-related causes beyond the ones I've counted, but even if you just count the ones I've counted, you come to about 1/3 of all human deaths. And putting that in perspective, that gets you to a pretty high number, 432 million in the years since the end of the Cold War, which is about twice as many as died from all the wars, civil wars, gulags, concentration camps, and so on, all the government-sponsored violence in the entire 20th century. So it is a very significant problem still, the poverty problem. Now, as I said, this shows that the most widely underfulfilled human right in the catalogue of human rights is this social and economic human right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and so on. So that is still a human right that is unfulfilled for the majority of the human population. So that's the first thing, the first step. We do have a very, very large human rights deficit in the social and economic area for sure. And now the next question is that a deficit avoidable? So I'm saying here as premise 2, it's foreseeable that most of this human rights deficit would be reasonably avoidable with an alternative design of these rules, meaning the current rules of the world economy, the global rules under which our world has come to operate in this period of globalization. So how can we show that? We can start with the global income distribution, which you see here. This is the distribution in 2005. It's a bit dated. I have later data, but since I don't have a nice pie chart, I gave you the one from 2005. You'll see the updated data a little bit later. And what you can see here is that the top 5% have a little bit less than half of global household income. The next 20% have about the same amount, 45% or so. And the remaining 75% squeeze in the remaining 10% of global household income, with the bottom half making it barely to 3%, and the bottom quarter only having less than 1% of global household income. So it's a very, very skewed global income distribution, and that already gives you a sense that probably it is feasible to divide the global income in such a way that the poorest people, the poorest half, let's say, have a little more. And to anticipate, if the poorest half of the human population had even 5% of global household income, that would be enough to end all these severe deprivations that we saw a moment ago. It's not necessary for them to have anywhere near 50%. All they need is somewhere around 5% to end extreme life-threatening poverty. Now, saying that, people will make two counter-arguments. One counter-argument that I hear a lot is that there has been so much progress. We are very close to the year 2015, and in 2015 we celebrate the end of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. Who has heard of those? Okay, pretty much everybody, yeah, that's what I expected. If you haven't heard of them 2 years ago, you certainly have now. The UN is talking about it and so on. And the Millennium Development Goals, please repeat after me, were a success, right? We lifted a lot of people out of poverty and so on and so forth. I'll have a little more to say about that further on. But anyway, we are trained by the media to count them as a success, and we have been told that extreme poverty has declined, that we are doing better in terms of hunger and malnutrition and so on. Most goals we have made substantial progress to. Yes, we haven't achieved every goal in every country, but we have made very significant progress, and we look forward to making more such progress in the next period to 2030. So these are the official views on the MDGs. One thing that should turn us a little bit skeptical is that actually the poorest people, the poorer half of the human population, and in particular the poorer 30%, have lost ground during that period. So they've made progress, but they've made progress only in absolute terms, not in relative terms. So if you think of global income as a pie or pizza, the share that goes to the poor has shrunk in terms of the angle, even though because of the growth of the pizza, they may have more than they had in 2000 or in 1990. But the most important thing to notice is that what matters in order to, for the assessment of the status quo is not the comparison of the status quo with an earlier period. Are the poor better off or worse off than they were in 1990? But what matters is the comparison with how well off the poor could be today. So what matters is how much of that enormous deprivation and poverty that we find today is actually avoidable today, would be avoidable today. And here, arguably, we are doing worse than any other generation in history, in that the amount of avoidable poverty today is much greater, whether you look at it in percentage terms or absolute terms. Today, all the poverty that exists is avoidable, whereas, let's say, 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, sure, a lot of poverty existed, but it wouldn't have been avoidable with the economic means and administrative capacities that were then available. So the old canard, right, that we have always had a lot of poor people with us, it's a thing that has always been there in human history, and we shouldn't get too upset about it, is just, I think, misleading because it overlooks the fact that what is completely new is the avoidability of poverty. Only in the last few decades have we gained the capacity as a human species to eradicate this life-threatening poverty of which, as I showed you, we still have so much in the world today. Now, the second counter-argument is a counter-argument not about the avoidability of poverty, but a counter-argument that global rules have anything to do with it. So this argument is one that's very popular. Again, you can read it in the Economist magazine almost every week in one form or another. And the argument is that there have been very different developmental paths in different countries. Some countries have developed very quickly and have eradicated poverty very effectively and quickly. Other countries have not done that. And these very diverse trajectories show that the causal factors driving poverty have to be local. It must be local factors. The story is told in many different versions, but one version would say, look at Korea and Senegal, let's say. They were both very, very poor in the early 1950s. Korea today is a pretty wealthy country. Nobody suffers hunger and deprivation there. Senegal is still a very poor country. So obviously it must be local or national factors that explain the difference between these two countries. It can't have anything to do with our global rules. Our global rules are fine, and the fact that Korea did well proves that fact. Now, this argument is a non sequitur. It shows, obviously, that local factors are relevant, but it doesn't show what it's supposed to show, that global factors are irrelevant. The quickest way to show that is to give an analogy. So the analogy is one familiar to you all, which is a teacher and a classroom. So you teach a course for a whole semester, and at the end of the semester you find that some of the students have learned a lot, other students have learned very little, and you conclude, of course, that the teacher is irrelevant to the learning success of the students, right? Because the teacher is a global factor, it's the same teacher for all. Some people learned a lot, so that shows that there's nothing wrong with the teacher. So by the same argument that we just rehearsed for global institutional arrangements, you would conclude that the teacher is irrelevant to the success or failure of the students in the class, merely on the basis of the premise that the students performed differentially well. Some did very poorly, some did very well. Now, that's obviously a nonsense argument, and there are at least three ways in which a teacher is relevant to the learning success of the students. One is that a better teacher would have led to better performance of all the students. The differences might have been the same, but the best students would have learned even more, and so would have the worst students. Secondly, the teacher is relevant because through the choice of teaching materials and teaching styles, the teacher will influence which students do well and which do poorly. So, for example, I use a good bit of pie charts and numbers in my teaching, and that may be more motivating for engineering students and science students, and more off-putting for humanities students, literature students, and so on. And if I use different teaching styles and different materials, then those who are now doing poorly might do better, and those who are now doing well might do worse. And thirdly, even some of the student-specific factors, such as motivation, might be influenced by the teacher. So a sexist teacher might turn off women, might demotivate women, for example, and teachers might, in various other ways, demotivate certain students and motivate certain other students. So here, student-specific factors are primarily, or in the first instance, to blame or are causally relevant, but they themselves are influenced by causal factors embedded in the teacher. So in all these different ways, the global factor teacher can influence not only the overall performance of the class, but also the discrepancies between student performance, who performs well, who performs poorly, and so on. And exactly the same thing is true with regard to global rules of the game, the rules of our world economy, and the performance of various kinds of developing countries. So it's not a coincidence, for example, that resource-rich developing countries did very poorly in this race for development, and I'll say a little bit more about that, what the reason for that is a little later. So this was only a negative argument, only an argument to show that the supposed proof that global factors, global institutional arrangements are irrelevant to the persistence of poverty is a bad argument, it's a non sequitur. Now, what we should look for is some of the factors that, in fact, do have an influence on the development of poverty. These factors, I think, work in two different ways. Global institutional factors work in two different ways. Some work directly, have a direct impact on poverty, and some work indirectly by affecting the national institutional factors that in turn have a profound influence on the development of poverty among poor populations. So the two arrows on your right are the analog to the sexist teacher, where basically you affect the motivation of the student and then that in turn affects the learning success. So here you affect, through global rules, the national institutional arrangements and the culture of a country, and that in turn has an impact on the development of poverty in that country. So here are some examples. Protectionism. So one piece of our new global institutional order is the World Trade Organization Agreement, which has protectionism built in, or grandfathered in, as it's called. The rich countries reserve the right to continue protectionism of their, in particular, agriculture, with various exemptions, including quotas, tariffs, anti-dumping duties, export credits, subsidies, and so forth, which protect local agriculture against imports, and also often hampers exports from developing countries by flooding world markets with artificially cheap subsidized products from the developed world. So that's everybody's favorite example of an injustice. Economists on the right and the left are agreed that this is very bad. It continues miraculously year after year, but really nobody has much good to say about it, and obviously it is something that really hampers development. Subsidies are still in the order of magnitude of $250 billion per year, which is about twice as much as all development assistance. So it is a very significant economic factor. A second thing is in pharmaceuticals. So one other thing that we had with this World Trade Organization agreement was Annex 1C, the so-called TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement prescribed a one-size-fits-all intellectual property regime for all the developing countries. So we now have 20-year product patents in every WTO member state as a condition of membership in the WTO, and that contrasts sharply with the system as it was before the WTO came into existence. Before that time, we had a very large plurality of different intellectual property regimes in different countries, with the technologically most advanced countries having pretty strong intellectual property protections, and the somewhat less developed countries having very weak intellectual property protections, because, of course, they don't benefit from strong intellectual property rights. Let me take India as an example to show you how things changed. India had, in pharmaceuticals, 7-year process patents before it came under TRIPS. Process patents protect a certain way of making a medicine, but Indian generic companies became very clever at inventing around the patent and making the same medicine on a different path, manufacturing it in a different way, and thereby very quickly offering for sale very cheap medicines to Indian patients and patients all across the developing world, where, again, weak patent rights prevailed, and so it was permissible to sell these medicines in other developing countries as well. And so poor people could pretty quickly get advanced medicines at cost plus, i.e. at the competitive price that competing pharmaceutical manufacturers would charge, without any violation of any patent rights, because in the countries in which they live, patent rights were weak. Now, India came under TRIPS. TRIPS was signed in 1995, but it kicked in for India in 2005. So India had to pass implementing legislation, had to go over to 20-year product patents. And a product patent means that any way of manufacturing the medicine is monopolized to the patent owner. So a generic company cannot make the medicine even in a new way. And so patients have to wait until the 20-year patent has expired in order to get access to that medicine. And so what happened is basically that Indian generic companies no longer provide these new advanced drugs to the rest of the world. And many patients, millions, die or suffer because they don't have access to these medicines. The medicines can only be sold and manufactured by the patent holder. And they do it, but they sell it at prices that are around 60 times or 100 times the cost of production, and so unaffordable to ordinary people in the developing world. So that's the second example. A third example, notable for its absence, is pollution rules. We normally have the intuition that when some people harm other people, then they should compensate for the harm that they do. We harm populations in the developing world through our excessive consumption that causes a great deal of pollution, resource depletion, and so on, global warming. Poor populations are more vulnerable to these things than we are. We have better ways to protect ourselves, and yet we pay no compensation whatsoever to the populations who suffer the effects of our consumption. Illicit financial flows, that's a topic that I got into in the last 2 or 3 years, which is really quite large. So enormous amounts of money are sucked out of the developing world each year, somewhere around $1 trillion or $1,000 billion, through various kinds of tax-related shenanigans. So the most important is that multinational corporations pay virtually no taxes in the developing world. They also pay very little taxes in the rich countries, by the way. And how do they avoid that? Very simple. They have subsidiaries in many different countries, and much of global trade is now happening within the same company among its subsidiaries. The point of that trade is often to reshuffle profits from one subsidiary to another. So to give a very simple example, if you produce something in India with subsidiary India and you sell it in South Africa with subsidiary South Africa, one thing you can do is sell it from India first to Bermuda at a very low price. So there's no profit in India because you sold at a low price. Then you sell it at a high price from Bermuda to South Africa. So there's no profit in South Africa because you bought it at a high price. And all the profit is in Bermuda, where, guess what, there is no tax on corporate profits. So companies have leeway in many different ways, through consulting contracts, through intellectual property right contracts, and so on. They have many, many different ways in which they can shuffle profit from one subsidiary to another, making sure that they make profits in those countries where taxes on profits are low or non-existent, and making no profit in countries in which taxes on corporate profits are substantial. So that's half of the trillion every year. Another good chunk is basically rich people keeping money offshore. So rich people keep their money in secret bank accounts, let's say in Switzerland or in Singapore or in Guernsey or whatever, London, Delaware, and they, of course, don't pay taxes that they owe to their home country on interest, dividends, capital gains, and so forth. So that's another very big factor, and again, a factor that affects developing countries much more than developed countries. In the US, that sort of offshore account, that's about 2% of financial wealth. In Europe, it's 8%. In Africa and the Middle East, it's 33% of all wealth that is kept offshore. And of course, these people, once they have secret bank accounts abroad, very few of them, if any, will actually declare their income from these accounts and pay taxes on them. So that deprives poor countries of tax revenues, and it also deprives them of capital, because these companies, of course, have to shift out the profits in order to save the taxes. Now, another is the 4 privileges. That is a very strange rule in our global institutional order, so deeply embedded that people hardly notice it. That is that we recognize any person or group exercising effective power in a country as entitled to sell the natural resources of the country, to borrow in the name of the country, to buy weapons in the name of the country, and to sign treaties in the name of the country. All of that regardless of how that person or group came to power and regardless of how it exercises power. What makes that rule strange is that it is so disanalogous to what we would do domestically, right? If I take my machine gun and walk into a Dutch department store and take it over, and people know that I've taken it over by force, nobody would recognize me as the legitimate person to deal with when you want to buy something in that store. Nobody would say that if you buy knowingly from this guy, you have thereby acquired legitimate ownership rights in the things that you bought. But that's what we do with natural resources. So if Sani Abacha or Obiang or somebody takes power in a country like Nigeria or Equatorial Guinea, and you buy oil from that person and pay that person and get a receipt from that person, then you are recognized by the courts and police forces anywhere in the world as the legitimate owner of that oil, even though the person you bought it from usurped power by force, was not ever properly elected, has no support from the population, in fact is suppressing the population, and so on. So people, just because they have power, are able to sell the resources, are able to borrow money, are able to buy weapons they need to stay in power. And that, of course, is a major part, if not the major part, of the reason why countries that are resource-rich tend to be terribly badly governed. Because it's as if there is a price set out on the head of the country. Anybody who can take over this country will then have these wonderful privileges, will be able to sell resources to anybody, will be able to borrow money in the name of the country against future resource income and so forth. So it's almost guaranteed in the world as we have it that these countries are badly governed by people who take power by force or people who have to pay off those people who could take power by force. Right? Every Nigerian general knows that he could take power by force or that they could collectively take power by force. So if the Nigerian president doesn't allow them to be corrupt and doesn't allow them to amass a lot of money, then he will very quickly become an ex-president. Good, that's the 4 privileges. Then we have the arms trade, obviously complementary, that people spend the money to import the weapons they need to stay in power. And labor standards, which once again are notable for their absence, just like pollution rules. We have a very precise system of intellectual property rights. Every country to be allowed to participate in our World Trade Order, World Trade Organization sponsored World Trade Order, has to abide by these intellectual property rights. But we don't have labor standards, which are as trade-related, at least as trade-related as intellectual property rights. And that means that we have an organized race to the bottom, where different poor countries have to compete with each other in offering ever more exploitable, ever more mistreatable workforces, where Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia are all competing for investment capital, saying, come to us, workers here are even more deprived of rights, even more cheaply paid, have even worse working conditions, and are even more accepting of bad working conditions than they are in that other country. So again, here it would be very, very useful if we had labor standards that put a floor under the way in which workers can be treated anywhere in the world, and would thereby stop that race to the bottom, or at least constrain it. Good, so I've said that a lot of the features of our emerging global institutional order, which basically came into existence and grew very rapidly in the post-Cold War era, the last 25 years in other words, that many of these features are features that were organized by the rich and for the rich. There was a lot of lobbying, of course, by major industry groups, and that lobbying created an order that was good for those rich industry groups and bad, by and large, for the poor populations. And you can see here on the next diagram the development of the global household income distribution. Basically, what you see is that the top 5% were big gainers. They gained about 3% of global household income over this 20-year period from 1988 to 2008. And the bottom 30% were big losers. They lost somewhere around 20% of their share of global household income during that same period. In between, it's a little bit up and down. So the Chinese upper and middle class were big gainers, obviously. You can see them there around the 6th and the 7th, 10th. But the big event happened in the top 5%. There was really a tremendous gain there of 3%, big shift. So for those who don't like numbers, I will repeat this information as a chart. So you can see here the development over that period. I hope that, yeah, it shows up there, good. So a pretty nice gain for the top 5% and a substantial loss for the bottom 2 quintiles, though it's hard to see because they were so small to begin with. The global wealth distribution, of course, is even more uneven and has also become much more uneven. This is the focus of some of the work that Piketty has done. We've probably all heard of that, recent best-selling book. And you can guess that wealth is more unevenly distributed by noting that most poor people have more income than wealth, more annual income than wealth. They have basically no wealth. and most rich people have more wealth than annual income. So that shows you that wealth is even more unevenly distributed than income. So the key facts regarding income for these 20 years is that over the past 20 years, the richest 5% have gained 3% of global household income, and that 3% is roughly the same as the bottom 50% of the world's population had at the end of that period. So just the gain of the top 5% is as large as the total share of the bottom half. Had the poorest 30% held steady, their income would be 21% higher than it is at the end of the period. So that's also interesting, given all the lifting that we are talking about, how many people we lifted out of poverty and so on and so forth. We worked so incredibly hard. Well, if we had done nothing, and if the poor had simply kept pace, if they simply had maintained their slice of the pizza, the same angle, so to speak, they would be 21% better off as of 2008 than in fact they were. So I'm not denying that we did some heavy lifting. I'm not denying that efforts were made. I'm just saying that these efforts were efforts of running up a descending escalator where we didn't quite keep pace with the escalator. We prevented greater damage to the position of the poor than would otherwise have occurred, but we certainly did not manage to keep the poor, the share of the poor in global household income, constant. And finally, and perhaps most remarkably, those 3% that came to the top 5% of the world's population, if these same 3% had gone to the bottom half of the human population, doubling their share of income from 3% to 6%, then poverty would already be history today. We could, with that extra 3%, in fact, with an extra 2%, we could have eliminated all that life-threatening poverty that I showed you in the very beginning. So this is what the world would then look like. We would have the bottom 2 quintiles roughly the same size as the middle quintile, and there would still be an enormous advantage of the top 5%, but at least the bottom half would have their basic needs met. So I conclude then from these two premises, sort of the first one was that we have an enormous human rights deficit. The second was that that human rights deficit is avoidable through better institutional design at the global level or supranational level. I conclude that the present rules of the world economy foreseeably produce massive human rights deficits and are therefore gravely unjust. For reasons of time, I will put the other two steps of the argument a little bit more briefly, but let me first say that what we find then, according to that first step of the argument, is that international law is in a way divided against itself. We have the Sunday parts of international law that are celebrating various human rights and are, quite enlightened these days. And then we have the everyday international law, which is that increasingly dense and consequential network of rules and regulations that regulate our economic system, our trading system, our finance system, our diplomatic order, and so on, which is designed more or less by the rich for the rich, and which is systematically undermining the fulfillment of those very human rights that we are proudly postulating in the Sunday part of international law. So with regard to the second step, so we start with the first premise that was the conclusion of our first step, the injustice of the present rules, and we then add the premise that agents who actively contribute to the design or imposition of foreseeably human rights non-compliant rules are thereby violating human rights. That was the point I made at the very beginning, that there are two different ways of violating human rights. You can violate them directly, and you can violate them indirectly through your contribution to a particular institutional regime that foreseeably and avoidably causes human rights deficits. And here, the agents that are primarily responsible for the shape of these international rules that are poverty aggravating are, of course, the governments who are instituting these rules, often with heavy lobbying by their major corporations. And among these governments is yours, which is obviously an influential player within the European Union, which is, again, an influential player in various kinds of global gremiums, like, for example, the G20, the G7, and so forth, and G20 in particular. And so through your government, you also have a certain responsibility for the shape of these rules, which is the object of the third step. So the third step is the responsibility for supranational rules lies first and foremost with the governments who are powerful enough to influence these rules, citizens who are supporting or tolerating unjust policies of their governments without making adequate reform or compensation efforts, thereby also become co-responsible for these rules. Most citizens of the more powerful countries are in that position, and therefore most of these citizens share responsibility for the details of the institutional order, the supranational institutional order, that I argue is doing a great deal of harm. So let's see where we get with this sort of an argument. This argument gives you a second responsibility, right? You might say, we started with consumer responsibilities, where you say, well, I am buying things here and there, and I know, or at least I vaguely know, that every time I make a purchasing decision, I change the world in some way. What I decide to buy has repercussions in other countries far away, in countries in which I know millions and millions of people are living on the brink of death, on the brink of extreme suffering of human rights violations. So it's very possible that in a shoe store where I buy one pair of shoes rather than another, that decision leads to the death, indirectly through the death of a human being in some other part of the world where these shoes are being made, or a t-shirt purchase or something like that. It's very likely that all of us have made purchases that have actually killed people, where had we bought something else in the same store, somebody who actually got killed would have survived, or somebody who survived would have been killed if we had made a different decision. But the problem is, as I told you at the beginning, nobody can really figure that out. We cannot know enough. We don't know about all the other purchasing decisions of all the other people in order to even begin to design our purchasing habits intelligently in such a way that we protect people or maximize survival in the developing world or anything like that. And so here we have a different way in which we also contribute to the poverty and severe suffering in the developing world, namely by helping to uphold an economic order or a whole institutional order at the supranational level that foreseeably and avoidably is associated with these very severe human rights deficits that we still find in our world. And so we have a different avenue for change, a more political avenue for change, where we can try to influence our government in the direction of fighting for fairer rules at the supranational level that would reduce that enormous human rights deficit that we still find today. So one citizen obligation that springs out of this argument is the obligation to use our influence with our government to try to influence it, that it uses its influence in international negotiations to design rules that are more mindful of the needs and interests of the poor and are less aggravating of poverty, more helpful to the poor, in all the ways that I showed you in that spider diagram where I listed some exemplary parts of our international rule system that are particularly hostile to the poor. So we have a negative responsibility to see to it, or to help to see to it, that the rules of our international order are more poverty avoiding than they are, and we are responsible for some of that poverty alongside, of course, many other citizens of many other powerful countries that also through their government are supporting these rules. And then secondly, we have a responsibility to compensate for some of the harm that we are responsible for qua co-upholders of the rules of our international order, we have a duty to compensate by protecting some of the people who get harmed by these rules. So most of the, if not all, but most, we can certainly say, of the human rights deficit that we still have in our world today would be avoidable through better supranational institutional arrangements. And since we are co-responsible for these arrangements, we can compensate for that responsibility, compensate for the harm that we do, by helping to protect some of the people who are harmed by these rules. So that would be the second point. So I think then that a more intelligent way of exercising our responsibility as consumers and as citizens who are contributing and deeply entrenched and embedded in the existing institutional order, which is a very interdependent one that connects us to the fate of people in the developing world, a more intelligent way to do justice to that responsibility is the political way, where we try to influence our government and thereby also intergovernmental negotiations in the direction of designing more just rules that will finally put an end to all this avoidable poverty. Thank you.
I would like to invite Professor Pogge to further discuss your very interesting lecture, and thank you very much for it. I think one question that could be on the minds of the people in the audience here listening tonight could be, we understand that through our consumption pattern or through our being a part of our government who partakes in upholding this unjust global order, we understand that we have a responsibility, and you have cashed out what they are, namely, first of all, to labor for reforms. That's a political duty. Yeah. And on the other hand, to compensate to the extent that we have harmed through participating in this unjust global order. But what could be concrete? What could be a concrete duty for the average consumer? I can understand that some would say, well, we all don't have as acute an insight into the consequences of our actions or into how we could be effective in bringing about political change. So let's say for the average citizen, how could this be cashed out in concrete practices?
Yeah, so obviously you are not born being capable of doing effective political action. You have to learn that. And the key thing, of course, to be effective politically is you have to work with others, right? Alone, you're completely helpless. There's nothing you can do alone. You can't influence the Dutch government, let alone anything above the Dutch government. But together, we can do a lot, right? And so you have to learn or look at historical mobilizations that were successful. So I mentioned a few, maybe just to give you an idea. The anti-slavery movement in Great Britain was a movement that had a few very high-level supporters. Wilberforce, for example, some sort of upper bourgeois people. He was a member of parliament and so on. But it had also a lot of people participating who were very poor. And so Manchester dock workers, for example, famously joined in the movement. And they didn't know much about political organization. They went on strike. You know, they risked their livelihoods and so on. And they learned how to be effective in terms of how to build an organization, how to influence other people, and so forth. Similarly, in my generation, when I was sort of pretty young, we had the Vietnam War going on. You know, we were very opposed to the war. We organized demonstrations. We had no idea how to do that, but we learned how to do it and build a kind of mass mobilization around it. I think that if young people in Europe in significant numbers took the world poverty problem seriously, I think they would certainly find ways to make their influence felt. It wouldn't be all that difficult to organize demonstrations or mass movements that would very quickly get European politicians to pay more attention to it.
Okay. And you explained very clearly that our obligation comes from human rights. They're based on human rights, the human right to a decent standard of living, and the human right to a global system in which our rights are guaranteed. So human rights is the basis for our negative duty and also for the positive duty that we just mentioned. But then I wonder, usually with human rights, if, for instance, I torture another person, or if, for instance, I do human trafficking, then there is a clear sanction. I will be punished. This is within the legal sphere, let's say. One could say, I have more difficulty imagining what could be the consequences of my not fulfilling my duties to the global poor as you have just sketched them. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, the consequence is nil, right? Nobody's going to jail you if you don't do anything to discharge your duties that I've just outlined, and that just shows that the human rights canon and the duties were written in a way that obviously involved significant participation by rich countries, important countries, and so on, who would never allow any such interpretation of human rights to go forward. I've tried to show by quoting Article 28 of the Universal Declaration that this was part and parcel of the initial idea of human rights, but of course we have now suppressed those more progressive elements in the Human Rights Declaration in favor of an interpretation that allows us to intervene in poorer countries, where we can go in and we can sort of say, look, you're not fulfilling human rights, and so for all sorts of reasons we can go in and intervene. So where human rights are useful as a justification for what we want to do, obviously we are happy to appeal to them, but in those cases where they go against our interests, we are perfectly happy to sideline the corresponding duties. I'm just saying intellectually, this idea that we have negative duties to see to it that any system of rules that we impose be at the very least human rights compliant, I think that idea is a very compelling idea, even if it isn't legally recognized.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to open it up to the audience. We're talking about mainly the consequences for the average consumer regarding his or her duties to compensate for his or her participation in the unjust global order that sustains global poverty predictably. Does anybody have any questions about that? It's a bright light.
If you can see anything, you have better eyes than I do.
Yeah, oh, there's one. Yes.
Is it not the problem of the corporations? Because corporations are, their main goal is profit. And they do not wish to compensate those people. For instance, in those countries you mentioned, like Nigeria, a lot of oil was dumped. People living in those villages have major health problems. They will not be compensated, as you say. Is it not something that we should force companies to do? And is it not like a problem of our system, of the economic system, as you mentioned a few times before?
Yeah, so that's certainly right. I mean, the corporations are profit-maximizing entities. That is their strength, and that is also their great weakness. And to what extent it is a strength and to what extent it's a weakness depends on how they're regulated, right? So if you have a system of corporations that are perfectly regulated in order sort of to make sure that the profits that they make are correlated with socially valuable outcomes, then corporations can be a great miracle. They can work really, really well. But of course, very often corporations are not so regulated. And very often the reason that they are not so regulated is because they themselves spend a lot of money and effort trying to change the rules that apply to them. So banks spend a lot of money and effort lobbying for rules or for relief from rules that would keep them focused on socially valuable outcomes, and so do any other kinds of corporations. So that's certainly a very big problem. Still, we have as citizens a fundamental democratic responsibility to see to it that our corporations don't get away with that lobbying, that despite the fact that they resist regulation and try to frustrate our efforts to regulate them, that we regulate them in such a way that their profits are closely aligned with socially valuable outcomes. So, for example, you mentioned Nigeria, right? Shell is operating in Nigeria. Shell is, at least to some extent, a Dutch company. I take it, is that right? I hope that's right.
British and Dutch. Yeah.
British and Dutch, yeah. So it's a Dutch company to some extent, and so it's a responsibility of you as Dutch citizens to see to it that Shell is regulated in such a way that they don't make a whole mess, environmental mess and human rights mess in Nigeria. Shell has been convicted a number of times, or at least credibly accused a number of times, of pretty dramatic human rights violations. And again, that's something that you would be in a position as Dutch citizens through the Dutch government to at least curb, if not completely eradicate.
Are there any other questions? Yes, here? Yes, you. In the third row, yes.
So, of course, we have a responsibility through the fact that we elect our own government. And my impression after what you said is that the action should be, first of all, a political one. But politicians and politics is connected to those 5% of richest people. And those richest people control politics, first of all, through the election. So in a certain sense, we citizens, we don't vote freely. Our vote is directed by those 5%. And in a second moment, all the actions of the politicians are dictated somehow by these 5%. So my question is, what would be the kind of things that we have to ask to the government, the kind of law that we have to ask to our government in order to have a government that is less bounded to those 5% richest people?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And of course, it shows that the problem is one of two levels, right? On two levels. We have the substantive problem of outcomes that are often hostile to the poor. And then we have the problem of democratic procedures, the undermining of democracy, where we have procedures that systematically favor the people with money and who can afford lobbies and so on and so forth. I come from a country, I live in the United States, where this is much, much, much worse than anywhere in Europe. We have politicians for sale basically all day long, right? They're auctioning themselves, they are auctioning legislative outcomes, and politicians are forever raising funds for the next election and have to do that in order to survive. So that's true, but I don't think that really relieves you of your responsibility. To the contrary, it gives you an additional responsibility to think about both these levels, namely how can we get better outcomes and how can we get better procedures, how can we regain democracy in our country. Right? So maybe I can throw in another one of my home countries, Germany. And Germany was a country that did some horrible things in the 1930s and 1940s during a period where it was less democratic than it had been before in the 20s, right? And Hitler passed the Ermächtigungsgesetz, where he gave himself through the parliament some extraordinary powers. And there, many Germans could have said, and many people said after the war, well, at that time, what could we do, right? I mean, he had given himself, the parliament had given him all these powers. It wasn't really possible anymore to work through parliament in the ordinary way. And so there was not really a lot that we could do. I think we would agree that there was a lot that citizens could have done, for example, not to collaborate in the economy, not to support the war effort in any way, through munitions factories, making uniforms and so on and so forth, let alone joining the army. So there were a lot of things that ordinary citizens could do and should do, even in a situation that isn't fully democratic. So I think I would answer the question in both ways. I would say, on the one hand, well, if your democracy is to some extent undermined by the fact that rich people have too much political influence, try to gain that democracy back, try to fight for it, and make sure that ordinary Dutch citizens can count as much as the richest of them, or nearly as much. And then secondly, even if you can't, even if the political process is beyond your control and is pretty corrupt and is essentially run by the rich, even then you can resist in other ways and try to frustrate the projects of these dominant forces in other ways.
Could I have a brief follow-up
Sure.
on that? I remember in one of your texts, I believe it was a reply to critics, you said you can also participate in unjust structures, like for instance Schindler in the Second World War. So you are not fulfilling your negative duty to refrain from harming, but as long as you adequately compensate for the measure of harm that you have inflicted, you are still within the scope of your duty. You have fulfilled your duty in that case. So in his case, he contributed to the German war effort with his factory, but he also saved many Jewish lives. Get back to the corporation question, is that maybe an analogy? Because very often we see that a lot of these corporations do not so good things. They participate in this global unjust order, but they also, for instance, start local schools or local hospitals or invest in infrastructure in certain places. Do they thereby escape their duty, or have they thereby fulfilled their duty? Or does it depend?
Yeah, I mean, the cases that I know about, there is a pretty large mismatch between the harm that they do and the compensation that they provide, right? So it's often very small things that are PR efforts that look good in glossy magazines, but if you look at the amount of money that is being spent, it is a minuscule part of their profits. And of course, that's, again, not surprising. They're profit-oriented enterprises, and they have to justify to their shareholders the expense as something that has enough PR value to justify the expense. And, you can't really do anything very substantial with that. So to take the example that one of the questioners brought up, the horrible environmental destruction in Nigeria wrought by these oil companies, they do a few local things, but it's not beginning even to make up for even 1% of the harm that they've done to the country.
So it's not in proportion to the harm that they've caused, it's merely appearance.
Generally not. I mean, I don't want to say that that's true for every company, right? There are some companies that do very little harm. Let's say the local gas company in Connecticut they do a few PR things, and they do pretty little harm on the whole, I think. And they do some good work, and there you might say they are neutral. But the major offenders that I have in mind in terms of lobbying for bad rules and regulations, both on the national and the international level, and doing enormous harm in terms of labor standards, environmental standards, and so on, those corporations typically don't make up for even a small fraction of the harm that they do.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, they're on the right. With the glasses? Oh.
Okay. Yes, following up on this question, maybe a bit more close to home. I work for the government, and I'm a bit scared now by your talk because, well, in a sense, working for the government, I support them, but my government also keeps in place these institutions and organizations. I try to do good in the work that I do, but do I do enough? Does the balance add up in the end? And am I, as a citizen, competent enough to know if the balance is adding up at this moment?
Yeah, so I distinguish two duties at the end, right? And with regard to the first of those duties, it is impossible to know whether you're doing enough or not. And that's a question that you just have to grow up and forget, if you can. So, for example, I mean, I ask myself, or used to ask myself sometimes, does anything I do actually make a difference? And if so, how much of a difference does it make? Is this all worth it? And the answer to that is, I have no idea. I have really no idea what the world would look like if I had never been born or whatever. And even with somebody really important, like Immanuel Kant, right? If Immanuel Kant had never been born, how would the world today be different? I bet you have no idea. I don't have any idea whatsoever. Nobody has any idea. And so did Immanuel Kant change the world for the better? Did he change it for the worse? How much of a difference did he make? We don't know. But the good thing is we don't have to know, really. We just do the best we can and leave the rest to future historians or anybody who wants to pay attention to that. I think what you should do in your role as a government official is to bring these moral considerations into the discussion. And when certain people who are affected by a Dutch government decision, directly or indirectly, have no voice, like, for example, many people in poor populations have no voice in these decisions, you can bring it up. You can say, but this, okay, this would be good for the farmers of the Netherlands, but it would be disastrous for farmers in Mali, because they would no longer be able to export and so on. And see whether you can change the debate in that way. Yeah, maybe you can't, right? But at least that's worth doing. Now, with regard to the second duty, it's much easier to be a little bit more precise, right? You can there say, you can more or less quantify the avoidable harm, which is the human rights deficit on my minimalist conception of justice. And you can say, well, if there are roughly, let's say, 1 billion people in my position in the world who are reasonably privileged, who have some access to a powerful government that might make a difference to how the global economic rules are shaped, then let's say the responsibility for the existing rules is falls onto 1 billion people, and what I have to do is I have to solve 1 billionth of the problem. So if there are 4 billion people living in human rights threatening poverty, then I have to make sure that I do enough to make sure that at least 4 fewer people live in such poverty, something of that sort. That's a very rough and ready calculation, but it gives you a sense of what you need to do to fulfill your negative duty, right? You still have positive duties to do more, because of course you know full well that of the 1 billion people in your situation, 990 million are not going to do their fair share of the work, and so the positive obligation is there and it's limitless. But your negative duty is done if you do your fair share of, or compensate for your fair share of the harm that we together do.
Yes.
Hello, good evening. I came from a country, Sierra Leone, in West Africa, and then there's a country with only 6 million population in my country. And then there's a country that's rich in mineral, iron ore, diamonds, so on and so forth, you know. And then less than 2 million people in my country have access to energy. And then less than 3 million people have access to clean drinking water. But we have, 2 major companies in my country, which is a mining company. One is the London Mining, and then the other one is the African Mining. But these 2 companies, like, they pay only 3% tax, because they negotiate with the government that they are going to pay only 3% tax, you understand? And then with this 3% tax also, they negotiate also with the government, so at least the government will give them a tax break, you understand? And then 1 month ago, the government gave these 2 companies more than 250 million tax break. But the people in this country, they have clean drinking water, no energy, no school, no infrastructure, no anything. So how will the citizens of that country will help the government to stand those companies who are so powerful in my country?
Will you tell us which country that is?
Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone, okay.
Yeah.
One of the very poorest countries in the world, Yeah, so this is unfortunately very, very common, a very common phenomenon, that these companies go to various African countries, and sometimes they exploit the inexperience of their political counterparts, of the people they negotiate with, and just say, look, this is what we get normally in Africa. We get these special deals, we negotiate these special deals that we pay a very low tax rate or something. But very often they also bribe the officials. So I would not exclude the possibility that they paid under the table money to some of the officials who then made the decision to give them that tax holiday. And so these are very, very bad deals that many developing countries are making with resource extraction companies in particular. And here I think one remedy would be to have an auction system, right? So if these countries said, we are willing to auction our mineral resources, and we could auction them, the different ways of running an auction. You can say, you get access to the site, and you can harvest as much resources as you can during a certain period. Or you say, you get access to the site, and you pay us such and such an amount per ton extracted. But the thing has to be priced out in terms for a time period of extraction or for an amount that you're extracting. And then you let competing resource companies bid. that will still run the risk that these resource companies will in some way collude with each other. They will say, look, in Sierra Leone, we let BP win the bidding. Everybody puts in a very poor bid and then let BP win. And then in another country, we let Shell win and so on. It's still possible to have collusion. But I think a tender or a bidding process would be much better than a process where you simply negotiate with one counterparty and decide on what the revenue sharing should be. You know, these deals are grotesquely one-sided, and resource companies make enormous profits extracting resources in these countries. You're completely right about that.
Would another possible solution be the global resource dividend that you talk about?
Well, that would not be a solution to that problem specifically, right? So the global resources dividend would be superimposed on that resource extraction system, where in this case Sierra Leone would have to pay a certain amount of money for the resources they extract. And then hopefully they would add that to the price that they charge the extractor company.
Okay. More questions? Yeah.
What's your answer to some urgent modern problem, the problem of emigration and immigration, especially from Africa? Many people are going to the United States or to the European Union in view of the injustice and all the kinds of problems you have sketched so well. But as to me, I would accept all of them, but we can't practically do this. What is your answer to this problem?
Yeah.
Immigration.
So, due to the problems that you have sketched, a lot of people want to come to the European Union. Or what should we do? Should we invite all of them? That's not practical, he says.
Yeah, so that's a difficult question. I'm very torn on this question because I have observed in Europe a shift to the right in many countries that used to be quite liberal. And I think the shift to the right is partly due to immigration. So that's not flattering for Europeans. It's a sad thing to see, but I feel that much as I am in favor of open borders in principle, or certainly more open borders than we now have, I also feel that it may be in the long run counterproductive, or even in the medium term counterproductive, that it will shift our polities to the right, and it will make Europeans a little bit more hostile to and xenophobic and hostile to foreigners. So I think that we can do vastly more for the problems that drive people to want to come to Europe by doing less harm where these people are living, and more good perhaps, but mainly less harm, than we can by opening our borders and letting some people in. One further consideration here is that generally speaking, the people who come to our shores, who manage to pay for the people who bring them here and so forth, are not the poorest of the poor. They're often the people who are somewhat better off. And so again, you know, we are at relatively high cost in terms of political goodwill and so forth, helping people who are not all that badly off, where we could, with the same resources and political capital, do a lot more for poorer people who are stuck where they are in the developing world. So my favorite solution to this problem would be to try to ease the problems where they are, rather than to have a much more liberal immigration policy, which is likely to lead to a further shift to the right.
Thank you. I'm obviously very much in favor of this call for the rich to plead against their own government, which protect the rich and introduce a global, a level playing field. I only wonder what one should say about the fact that many citizens draw a different conclusion. I mean, many people seem to have gone no global, seeing sort of globalization in terms of capitalist flows that do more damage than create benefits. Because it's quite easy to say, well, in the case of slavery, it was quite clear. It was easy to solve, let's abolish that, and there was not a big systematic question involved. And the question, as you said, in the case of the supermarket where we buy the shoes, but the same thing is also true with global rules. They are so complex that it's very difficult to know which rules we should demand of our governments to implement. So what I noticed that those people who do think, who clamor for a change in rules, they tend to say, well, let's stop this amazing idea of abolishing protectionism, having even more flows of goods and capitals, because that's going to destroy the world even more. So withdraw to some kind of bucolic system of local self-sufficiency rather than a further exploitation of universal flows of capitals and merchandise.
Yeah, so one thing I would say is that this is really quite unrealistic to roll back globalization. I don't think that is in the cards at all. So very, very difficult to envisage that happening. I mean, it could happen through some major political catastrophe of some sort, but I think that in the foreseeable future, globalization is here to stay, and we will have, if anything, greater interdependence, greater trade flows and so forth, and also flows of human beings. And of course, in many ways, globalization has tremendous potential, right? It's nice to live in a world in which you can easily travel from one place to another, in which you can sample the goods and eat the foods of different parts of the world and so on, participate in one another's cultures and so on, build understanding. So it's, I think, important to stress the distinction between globalization with a little g, which is the particular globalization that we've experienced in the last 25 years, and globalization with a capital G, which is just the fact that we grow closer together and have much more interaction and interchange and live under common rules. So I think the problem is with the little g, with our particular version of globalization rather than with globalization as such. And then to the second point, I think that you are somewhat overstating the difficulty. Of course, if you come to the problem just as a layperson, right, to ask yourself, so exactly how should a trading system be formulated so that it gives the poor populations at least a pretty good chance that they can participate proportionately in global economic growth. It's not obvious how you answer that, but we certainly have collectively the expertise to answer questions like that. So think about the national level. At the national level, when we see that income inequality is increasing, we know what to do about that, right? We can introduce different types of taxation, a more progressive system of taxation, for example. We can tax different things rather than have a consumption tax. We have more money through an income tax. We switch from payroll taxes to income taxes and so on. So there are all sorts of things that economists have figured out about how one does that. And of course, to some extent, there will be trial and error involved. To some extent, we don't know ahead of time how a particular rule will work itself out and how it will affect the income distribution. But then if we find after 2 or 3 years that the effects are different from what we expected, or that maybe clever accountants have found ways to frustrate the intent of the rule, we rewrite the rule. We learn from our experience. So I think that is much, much less hopeless than the endeavor that I described at the very beginning of timing and targeting your purchases in such a way that each of your purchases has the best possible impact on the world at large. So I think with rules we can do quite a lot better than with these individual consumption decisions.
I think we have one more question from the room. Yes? In the front row? Okay.
Yeah. This one, the blue one.
Yeah.
I was wondering about your distinction between positive and negative rights, because you state that we have equal negative rights to all people, because you gave us an example of hitting someone with a car. However, I think that at the moment where you actually hit the person with a car, that person comes closer to you into your inner circle. So I feel like this distinction between positive and negative rights and the extent of our duties towards these people. I don't know to what extent this distinction should be, and if you consider that, well, just that person. That was it.
Yeah, so first of all, the distinction was not between positive and negative rights, but between positive and negative duties. So I don't think it makes a difference to your question, but I don't distinguish between positive and negative rights. I don't think there is such a distinction that makes any sense. But duties, and so what I want to say is that our negative duties are pretty much equally stringent regardless of whom we have these duties towards, right? And about your case, that when you hit the person, then you have a more intense, right? I think you can see that that doesn't work. If you just sort of think you're driving drunk somewhere and you're endangering people, you're not actually coming into contact with anybody, maybe you don't hit anybody, but you endanger people who live in the area in which you drive drunk. And then the person who thinks the way I criticize would say, well, if I do that in remote rural India, where the only people I might conceivably endanger are Indian civilians, and I'm a person from the Netherlands, so these are not my country people, that person would say it's much less wrong to drive drunk in rural India than to drive drunk in rural Netherlands, where the people I would likely kill with my car are compatriots. So then the case would be symmetrical, and you would still say that the wrongness of driving drunk in these two different locations is roughly the same, assuming that the danger that you impose on civilians is roughly the same. Or wouldn't you say that?
It becomes your own experience, so the situation is closer to yourself. Whereas if you buy, for instance, a product, you're buying something which has a chance to do something to another person, but the effect is not that direct. So isn't it only logical that citizens are not organizing themselves to do something about this, because the effect is much further away from them? So basically what I'm saying is that it's maybe only a natural behavior of people because they don't see what the effects actually are.
Yeah, right. That could explain why people are sort of, it's supposed to explain why people are not particularly exercised, or some people are not particularly exercised by the harm that they do through their consumption decision to distant strangers, right? Is that? So I think I get a better grasp of where your question is driving to. So that seems right, that for many people these are very remote effects, and so people tend to minimize or tend to basically sort of leave out of account effects that are either remote or are very small. That you say, well, yes, okay, fine, so I buy T-shirts, and so these T-shirts maybe are made under horrible labor conditions, so in some sense I'm contributing to horrible labor conditions in Bangladesh by buying this T-shirt, but the hundreds of millions of other people are also buying these T-shirts, and if I didn't buy these T-shirts, the factory would still exist, I don't really make a difference, and so on. I mean, that's what many people think, right? That my contribution is too small, it's a very big thing. This textile factory in Bangladesh is producing millions of T-shirts, one person more or less buying the T-shirt doesn't make a difference, and so forth. So the remoteness and also your being part of a very large group of people engaging in the same behavior, both of those things have the psychological effect of distancing you from the impact. So I think that's right, but I also think that as a psychological matter, it's right, but I also think that as a moral matter, it's not right. I mean, it's something that Derek Parfit has analyzed very effectively in chapter 3 of his book, Reasons and Persons, where he talks about 5 mistakes in moral mathematics, and he sort of analyzes that this should not make a difference to us whether, let's say, each of us is doing a small harm or is doing a significant harm to one person, or 1 million people are together doing something which harms significantly 1 million persons. And so many modern day situations are of the second type, where rather than each of us harming one person, 1 million together are harming 1 million people. And we should be indifferent as to which of those two it is, right? We should take these harms that we together do just as seriously as harms that we do individually. But that's history, that's the progress, if you like, right? In the bad old days, harm was done by individuals to individuals, right? A slave owner was beating his slave. Today, we do the harm as large collectivities. You know, many people in Europe are buying a certain type of T-shirt, and then many people in Bangladesh get harmed in some way. And if the harm is the same and the benefit is the same, then the value of the action, the moral value of the action is the same, even though the way in which we are related to the people who get harmed is much more indirect in the modern case than in the older case.
Maybe it's time for one last question.
That would bring us back to your second obligation as a citizen, the consumer responsibility. And can you tell a bit more about what that could be, apart from political influence?
Yeah, so the second was the compensation one, right? Is that the one you mean? Is it still, or it's no longer on the board? The compensation one, yeah. So that's not just something that you do as consumer, but it's also something that you do that you can do through effective NGOs, for example. So let me give a few examples. There are a number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that do really fantastic work in the developing world. It's a minority. Most of these organizations are pretty ineffective. So it's crucially important, if you really want to compensate, that you work with the right organization, because your compensation is not measured in terms of how much money you give or how much of your time you give, but it's measured by how much you actually achieve for the poor people whom you are also, together with many other people, harming. So what matters here is the result, right? Now, there's one good website that is a pretty serious assessment website for non-governmental organizations called givewell.org. And that website gives you a very good detailed accounting of various good NGOs and how effective they are. That's worth knowing about. Another thing you could do is to do something personally. So that I do some of that simply because I don't always want to rely on NGOs, but I have some friends in the developing world who help me spend money effectively on projects in communities. So in a rural Philippine community, for example, there was a researcher who's worked with that community for a long time. It's indigenous people. And so she said that what this community really importantly needs is some carabaos, some big water buffaloes for doing the plowing, the harvesting, and so forth. And also it gives some bad-tasting milk, but apparently pretty healthy milk. And so I donated some carabaos in that context. So there are various kinds of things that you can do where you have actual first-hand knowledge in a particular community or know somebody who has first-hand knowledge. So there are various things that you can do to effectively protect people from life-threatening poverty in the developing world through effective NGOs and through personal efforts. And all of us can do that, not without some study, but with a little bit of homework. That is something that is pretty straightforward.
Okay. I think in closing, one last question I would like to ask. Well, we can imagine that we have various duties. And say some of us find it more important to dedicate our time, resources, energy to animal welfare or to protecting a national park or to assist the elderly in our neighborhood. It would be difficult to say that these people are not doing a good job or aren't trying to act morally. At the same time, it causes them to be able to do less to fulfill their duties to the global poor. In such a case, would you say that they are violating their duty, and if so, is then the duty to the global poor, as it were, more weighty, or does it trump these other duties? How do they relate, the various duties we have?
Yeah, so if the argument I gave is a correct argument, then yes, you would be violating because it's a negative duty, right? So it's a little bit like saying so let's say you've borrowed money from me, and you say, well, actually, I don't pay you back your money because I would rather give the money to the local older people or to the children's playground or something like that. That would be a violation of your duty because you borrowed the money, you owe me the money back. And only the money that you legitimately own, that's really your money, that you don't owe to anybody else, only with that money can you then decide where to give it. And so I would say the same in this case here. So if you have negative duties, if you have harmed people, as I argue that we are in the process of harming people by imposing certain rules on them, then we have to compensate for that harm first and foremost before we do other good things. Right? So I assume here that your duty to the elderly or the duty to the local playground and so on, these are positive duties. These are good things to do. Of course, it's better that you do that than that you don't. But you have to do it with the resources that are left over after you've fulfilled your negative duties.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Pogge for his lecture.